have a fabulous host, Emmanuelle, going to give a fantastic session with fabulous allies. But I just, obviously right now, someone comes at the door and I'm just going to ignore them. I just want to say, give a little bit of an introduction about why we are here and what we're all about before I hand over. So very happy to see so many people on the screen who are with us on a journey to accelerate the shift towards the regenerative economy. And we do that by fostering the bonds between each other, with self, others, and nature. And today we have what we would call a regenerative learning session. It will take 1 hour. Many of you are also part of the regenerative leader circles. Some of you are part of the regenerative venture circles, and many of you were at the Regenerative Summit. So great to see you all. And I now can just give the floor to Emmanuelle, who's been part of this wonderful journey, and she's going to be a host of the day. So Emmanuelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christophe, and welcome everyone. Welcome to this discussion space brought to us by the Regenerative Alliance. And we are here today to discuss going beyond net zero carbon with regenerative businesses and to explore together leadership and collective action in the race to zero and beyond, and to take insights and questions ourselves about what net zero carbon and climate neutrality really means. What type of leadership skills does it take, or what type of leadership skills are needed for bold business commitments and implementing action at scale, and how to go beyond net zero and accelerate the regenerative economy. I am Emmanuelle Aoustin, and I will be hosting the session. When I joined as a CEO of the Regenerative Alliance in December last year, I came on board with a specific mission to bring concepts and operational reality and to kickstart the Regenerative Alliance, especially with the RA Summit that Christophe mentioned in September. And my mission as the launch CEO of the Regenerative Alliance is now mission accomplished. And I'm now shaping the next leg of my regenerative leadership journey. And I'm also shifting to being a fully participating ally of the Regenerative Alliance. And I join you in that role today. My background is in the science of sustainability, where carbon accounting plays a very central role around the idea that what gets measured gets managed, or simply put it, fact-based, sound decision-making around carbon and environmental issues. And I've invited to join me on this panel today Marion Verles and Jean-Guillaume Peladan. Marion is the CEO of Sustain CERT, the ambition of which is to mainstream credible climate and SDG impact accounting and certification. And Marion, you're calling us from Zurich today. Hi, Marion. Can you say hello?
Hi, everyone. Hi, Emmanuelle.
And Jean-Guillaume is on the panel. Jean-Guillaume, you are fund manager at Sycomore Asset Management, a certified B Corp and a Société à Mission, a pioneer and leader in responsible investment. You are also head of environmental investments and research. And Jean-Guillaume, you're calling us from Paris today. Hello, Jean-Guillaume.
Hi.
Hello. So before we dive in together in the benefits and challenges related to what net zero means, let's start and get the facts and the definitions, I'd say, right, and let's align on them and what we're talking about. So science defines carbon neutrality as the carbon neutrality of the planet, as a state of equilibrium where anthropic CO2 emissions and anthropic CO2 absorptions are at an equilibrium. So a state where we stop accumulating CO2 into the atmosphere, and hence where we stop the increase in temperature. And in order to stay well beyond 2 degrees Celsius, or in order to achieve this 1.5 degrees Celsius, that state of equilibrium or climate neutrality for the planet needs to happen before 2050, so the middle of the century. And to get there, 2 pathways need to be combined. The first one is to reduce drastically the CO2 emissions, and I'm using drastically for good reason, and in parallel to find carbon storage solutions which will compensate the remaining emissions. Given the size of the efforts in both fields, net zero, or this carbon neutrality, comes not as a transition and rather radical shift. Okay, that was your 1-minute MBA on climate neutrality. And I'm now taking it a first question to Jean-Guillaume. When we discussed together about that concept of net zero, you mentioned you had a lot of concerns, especially the zero washing claims that we've seen come up from organizations and products claiming carbon neutrality, net zero, carbon negative, and so on. Yeah, and I'd like you to share, what your concerns, why do you have those concerns, and how do you take those claims into account in your analysis of businesses? Jean-Guillaume?
Yeah, thank you. It's a very vast question. What I would say, when we hear net zero, we have to understand what does it mean, what is the perimeter, and also when, because it's not the same thing if it is in 2030, 2050, or on a longer time span. And what we observe since, I would say, COP 21, 6 years ago, is a sort of explosion or tsunami of many information and a sort of new race, a net zero race. And it's rather a mess, mixing very new piece of science that have been brought by the new IPCC reports, especially the special reports, which are mentioning the links between ocean and climate, between cryosphere and climate, and also the number 6 report of the working group number 1 that was released in August. And all these reports are converging with more urgency, of course. And there we have observed also a dynamic of institution in general with new alliance. And there is, for example, in finance sector, now 7 net zero coalitions, and even an additional one, which is the Alliance of Alliance, that was announced at Glasgow. So we have many initiatives. And on the other side, we have now, since 6 years too, a very dense news of bad news concerning extreme weather events, floods, fire, heat peaks, etc. And so there is a lot of new elements, and we have this carbon neutrality race with a lot of greenwashing. And first, I think information. When we want to address this systemic issue, one of the traps is to consider that carbon equal to environment, which is completely false. Carbon and carbon neutrality just one piece of the puzzle, and I think it's very important to keep in mind that environmental subject and biosphere is something complex, and that carbon is just one element. It's just one out of 9 planetary boundaries. And we have, for example, in the finance sector now a sort of biodiversity catch-up, and with now there is a TFND replacing or being the next step of TCFD, and we have a lot of initiative looking at biodiversity. And what we are invaded by announcement of not only net zero companies, but also net zero investors, net zero products. A lot of in the news now. We are full of this type of claim, and the majority of it is false, completely what you called washing. And we have now also emerging some serious framework for the carbon accounting and neutrality accounting. And so in France, we have now the Net Zero initiative that was launched 2 years ago. And it was this framework basically say that you can be carbon neutral at the scale of the world, or as a geographic entity, but for an economic entity, to be carbon neutral is just not scientifically based. And this opinion, so this framework, is now an official framework in France. It has been fully backed by the French Agency for the Ecological Transition, ADEME in French, and also the French regulator of the financial market that says the same thing. And you have to distinguish the emission reduction, but from the avoided emission, which are not absolute but relative. So you cannot add the reduction and retrieve the avoided emission. You have to make a separate account. And also you have the carbon sequestration that you need to have a separate account of it. And it's very dangerous to mix them. So in this very complex framework and rich panorama, we need a lot of transparency and also a lot of skills. I would say it's something not so easy. And keep in mind that carbon is not the only element of our future environmental sustainability.
Yeah, we'll take that that topic further in a few questions from now. What was interesting is what you were saying to me, Jean-Guillaume, that when you're looking at investing into some of these companies with such claims, you actually take it as a signal to investigate further the reality of the climate commitments and trajectories.
Yeah.
I wanted to take the question to Marion as well in this net zero acceleration of the net zero topic, because you had an optimistic outlook on it, saying, let's there's the accounting discussion, but let's, take it from a higher perspective. It's actually a tipping point for radical innovation. Marion?
Yeah, absolutely, Emmanuelle, and I think just as a preface, maybe about myself, I indeed consider myself an optimist and a realist. So I'm trying to look at the world through those two lenses. So when I think about net zero, the realist in me obviously acknowledges the sense of urgency, and that could not be understated. I think the sense of urgency is there. Just going back to your explanation at the beginning, Emmanuelle, and for everyone participating to this session, I think you can think about net zero as basically putting a ceiling on the stock of carbon that we can have in the atmosphere, right? And the quantity of CO2 trapped in the atmosphere directly influences the increase in temperature. So net zero is about keeping that stock of CO2 in the atmosphere to a constant level. So it's about stopping the increase in the carbon stock in the atmosphere. Each year, we emit about 40 billion tons of CO2. So these are our net emissions every year. So if you think about our carbon budget, how much more CO2 can we afford to put into the atmosphere before we put our Earth into an unstable state, or before we cross some of those tipping points that Jean-Guillaume mentioned earlier? So at that current rate of 40 billion tons a year, we basically have 7 years left before we cross the 1.5 degree threshold. So that gives us the sense of urgency, right? So we basically, at the current pace at which we're spending our carbon budget, right, we've got 7 years left. So that's the realist in me, and where the sense of urgency is coming from. The optimist in me will say that whilst I would agree that there's a tendency, I would say, to take too much comfort from the private sector momentum that's happening. And I would agree that we're taking too much comfort from what's happening in the private sector. I would also agree that I believe we're potentially on the verge of a systemic change. And I do see the possibility of transforming our system, because beyond those net zero commitments that we are witnessing, I believe there's a process underneath it happening, which is about redefining value. And I do see that beyond those net zero commitments that corporates are putting out, there are a number of private sector leaders and public sector leaders that are actively working to redefine value and to redefine what it means to be successful as a company, and to redefine what it means to be successful as a business leader. And just taking a couple of recent examples, right, in the news that sort of keep me optimistic and prevent me from becoming depressive about the state of our climate, basically. So there was a recent announcement from the CEO of Mars just before COP. And what is important to keep in mind is that Mars is a privately owned company. It's not a publicly listed company. And so the CEO of Mars basically communicated about Mars net zero ambition. And he also communicated about some of the best practices that need to be part of those net zero ambitions, including the fact that if a company like Mars is serious about being net zero, it means that every single of Mars suppliers also need to embrace net zero. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of suppliers. He basically said that the challenge for a company like Mars in delivering net zero is about engaging all of their suppliers on the journey. He also said that if you want to know whether a company is serious about net zero, look at the way that company rewards senior leaders' performance. And he made a very clear statement that environmental performance would be a key component of the performance of all of their senior leaders. Another company like Danone, for example, has started, sort of led the movement there a few years ago already, and included carbon performance targets in the targets of most of their managers. So it wasn't even top leaders, it was managers across the company. And then the third evidence that can help you understand whether a company is serious and genuine with their net zero targets is whether they are changing the metrics they use to define success, right? Because if you are serious about decarbonizing your company, you need to stop measuring success only by measuring profit. You need to roll out new metrics. And again, the example of Danone, French company that implemented a carbon adjusted earning per share a couple of years ago. So they are now reporting to their shareholders, not only on how much money they are making per share, but they are taking away from the profit the cost of carbon. So the earning per share that is reported to shareholder takes into account the carbon intensity of the business model. And once those metrics are actually rolled out, as the CEO, as the top management of that company, you have an incentive to decarbonize your business model. And so that's basically, in a few words, what is keeping me optimistic about the situation, and why I believe that beyond those net zero commitments, there's actually potentially a systemic change underway.
Thank you, Marion, for sharing your feelings about being pessimistic, optimistic. This reminds me of a webinar I was following where I was listening to Stefan Harding. He's one of the, I think, co-founders of the Schumacher College, together with Satish Kumar, who is also one of the speakers at the RA Summit. And Stefan Harding was saying, you know, optimistic, pessimistic. One thing that is important is to take the time to feel inside us the worry, the anxiety, the pressure. So we understand with all our senses, our feelings, our emotions, the magnitude of the challenge for the planet, for kids, for ecosystems. So take the time to feel that. And he said, and don't get stuck, don't get paralyzed. Go back to your contribution to the world and do what you do best. You build hope because you're working with courage and connectedness. Something will come out. So that reminded me of this, yeah, what you were saying, this balance between optimistic and pessimistic. And also you opened up this topic of how we drive climate action in businesses. And I wanted to ask you, Jean-Guillaume, a couple of years ago, you launched the NEC, the Net Environmental Contribution, with the idea to develop a metric that could measure the contribution of businesses to the energy and the environmental transition. And two questions for you. The one is, well, first of all, it's called the NEC, and it's not called, so it's called the Net Environmental Contribution, not the net carbon contribution. You mentioned how important it is to widen the scope. And you also, you know, what is that metric? A metric to measure the regenerative transition. How do you see that? Can you share a little bit on the NEC?
Yes, sure, please. So, yeah, for the first question, of course, is not carbon only, as I mentioned, and what we know about environmental impacts is that, of course, they are interdependent. and complex. And for example, in a life cycle analysis, you have more than 10 different parameters. Generally, you have between 12 and 15. And we have 9 planetary boundaries. We have 6 European environmental objectives in the plan for sustainable finance. And often facing this complexity, the answer for people who don't want to change, or maybe lazy people, or I don't know, pessimistic people, they say, oh, it's too complex, we don't have the data. And so we start with one, for example, carbon, that's easy, there is a lot of data. And so the NEC, which is a methodology, which is completely public and transparent, is just an answer to this problem, saying, no, it's possible. And in fact, we have a lot of information that we can compute on a transparent and scientific way. And it is the proof of concept, which is more than now a proof of concept, but it's a full operational methodology, which is used by more than 12 different institutional players. And in this methodology, the approach is very pragmatic. We are aggregating the main environmental impacts. So when we are speaking about agriculture and food, we look at climate, water, and biodiversity, which are by far the main impact of all the food, vegetal and animal food, of course, all the main impact of the whole value chain. When we speak about mobility, we take into account the first impact, which are, of course, emissions of greenhouse gases and also air quality, which is a very sensitive issue. And by the way, climate is a very popular issue, but what is killing people today? When we look at the statistics of the origin of death from environmental causes, which is more than 12 million people per year, the majority of those deaths are due to air quality problems. And so, of course, climate will kill in the future, and it's already disturbing and creating a lot of climate refugee, but environmental issues are multi-criteria, and for example, air quality problem, it's killing more today. And so this is the answer to the first question. Yes, it is really possible. So we have to be non-carbon only, or no, to integrate the holistic view, and it is feasible. And with the second point, in fact, what we have demonstrated and on a practical way with the NEC is that it's possible to compute the very high quantity of information available about environmental performance. And we have two main sources. The first one is the aggregation of all the life cycle analysis made by EcoInvent, made by a lot of international and independent bodies, and basically the LCA database, and which are in general public, very accessible. And the second type of source is the certifications. So of course, you have to put aside the self-declarative certification and use the most serious one. So you have a lot of environmental certification. In fact, you have hundreds of them, depending on the sector, but it is providing a guarantee of a minimal environmental performance compared to what is not certified. And it is possible, we have done in the NEC, to convert this certification into an environmental ranking, which is used by the NEC. And so the classical objection, of the people who say, oh, we have not the data, so we cannot be transparent, It is completely true. And whatever the company, listed or not listed, they always communicate on their service and products. And this is the main source of the information, which are feeder of the NEC.
Thanks, Jean-Guillaume, for this this insight. I just wanted to mention to all of you here that we'll have a chance to take a couple of questions. So you could either post your questions in the chat, and we'll take them, or prepare your question. And also, if you know about initiatives that are helping to standardize or normalize the question around net zero, please feel free to share them in the chat. Recommendations for where to start when you're new to the field. If you also have examples of businesses like Marion shared about Mars and Danone that have demonstrated real climate leadership and or are going beyond net zero, please also share them in the chat. And I wanted to take this next question to you, Marion, before we open up. You have your background with the gold standard, and now with sustained search around verification and certification solutions, especially in the area of carbon credits and value chain emission reduction and removals. And my question to you is, how do these mechanisms contribute to net zero? How do they help us get there? And yeah, what are the win-win benefits of such mechanisms?
Yeah, happy to talk about carbon offsetting, Emmanuelle, and starting maybe with a personal story. I got into the carbon markets back in 2005, so quite some time ago. I was taking a gap year as a student. We traveled with a friend of mine for 9 months around the world to discover triple bottom line business models. And as part of that journey, we met with a French NGO in Cambodia. And that was, I would say, a coup de coeur with their work. They were distributing to Cambodian households what is called improved cooking stoves. Cooking on 3 stones or on highly inefficient stoves kills hundreds of thousands of women and children every year. Because they cook in those small houses, and the children on their backs or lying on the floor are breathing the smoke, and it's killing many people every year. And so that NGO was selling at low cost improved stoves that were very simple, but that were reducing significantly the smoke and using far less wood in a country that was prone to deforestation. And they were coming to the end of their European Union grant. So it was the second 4-year grant. And after that, the program manager was telling me, Marion, in 18 months, we're running out of money. There won't be any official development assistance for us anymore. Either the program's going to end, or we find an alternative source of fund. And the alternative source of fund that they were looking at the time was carbon markets, selling offsets. And they were one of the first, if not the first, improved cook stove project developer successfully registering their project under the voluntary carbon market, selling carbon credits to European companies willing to offset their emissions. And that way, basically opening up an entirely new financing stream to scale up their program. And with carbon finance, they became, I think, the most successful improved cook stove program ever. They rolled out millions of stoves in a country that counts something like 8 million people, right? So it was a massively successful program. So again, that's the optimist in me that sees the glass half full and the potential that such a market can have, and the impact that this can drive on the ground, tangible impact for people on the ground. So that's for the story and the potential of carbon markets. I also want to say that net zero is not about offsetting. It's not about offsetting. Jean-Guillaume mentioned earlier the net zero initiative. That's really French. I would encourage everyone to look at this initiative, but also look at what's happening with the Science-Based Targets Initiative, SBTI. They are a consortium with World Wildlife Fund, World Resources Institute, so really highly reputable civil society organizations, and they've launched just before COP the first version of the net zero standard that defines what it means to be net zero for a corporate. And there are basically two pillars. Pillar one is decarbonize as quickly as you can, but at a minimum in line with what science requires us to be at 1.5 degrees. And whilst you decarbonize as quickly as you can, and they have frameworks to assess whether corporates are decarbonizing as fast as necessary, in the same time, you need to remove emissions. And so those are the two pillars of net zero. And offsetting is one tool in the toolbox to achieve removals, but it's only one tool. The gist of net zero is deep decarbonization and neutralizing emissions by sequestering as much as we can.
Thank you, Marion. And we're talking about decarbonization in the magnitude of 90 or 95% of your emissions that need to be dropped, depending on which sectors. We now have the time to take 1 or 2 questions for the panel before we move on to a next series of questions around what it is to be a climate leader.
And maybe, Emmanuelle, I realize I have not understood your not answer to your second question about how the NEC is integrating regenerative economy, but of course, the NEC is a scale of from -100% to +100%, and 0% in the middle, being the average economy of today. And of course, low tech and regenerative solution are on a very positive side. And for example, a bicycle, which is a very easy to understand example of low tech, is a +100% NEC.
Thank you for this highlight. Time to raise your hand or open your mic for a question to the panel. Marcello, you have one. I'll see if the audience wants to raise their hand. Go on, Marcello.
So thanks so much. I have a question. It doesn't matter, Marion or Jean-Guillaume. Just yesterday I was reading that in Europe, there's a huge variety of the source of energy. So like Portugal is nearly renewable because they don't have coal, they don't have fossil fuel, they have a lot of wind and hydrogen. And countries like the Netherlands, where I live, is very high. Like 70% of the energy in the Netherlands comes from fossil fuel, and in Portugal is less than 10%. So the question is, this is a big limiting factor because a lot of carbon is actually in the energy. So if you are a manufacturing company in the Netherlands, you don't have you cannot source renewable energy because your government doesn't make it, you know. So what do we do about it? Because you say about greenwashing, but for some companies, it's quite difficult to shift their sources of energy. So really, that's my question. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Let's see if we take another question together. Anyone wants to raise their hand? I saw in the chat that there was a question as well on if I'm a business leader or an entrepreneur, where do I start on climate leadership or getting to net zero? If you want to answer that as well. Jean-Guillaume and Marion, let's make the answer short if you can. Go on.
Yeah, maybe very shortly to Marcello. In fact, electricity is not energy. You were speaking about country electrical mix, which are very heterogeneous. But energy is a much more wide problem. And on the side of fuel, for example, for mobility, you have about the same mix everywhere in the world. And also, you have more than power and fuel, you have also heat. And there is a very varied mix. So you have a lot of solution, and a lot of company can sign PPAs with renewable power producer, and they can do it quickly. And there is a race today, and most of the new capacity, the majority of the new capacity of renewables power today is sourced from a PPA, so private purchasing power purchasing agreement with private company. So there are solutions.
Thank you.
Marion, maybe if the question to you, or if I'm a business leader, an entrepreneur, where do I start?
Yeah, it's a good one. Just on energy quickly, what I wanted to say is that there are two transformations happening in parallel. One is a transformation in the energy mix. And the International Energy Agency, if you look at their reports, give you an indication of energy mixes in 2030 and 2050 compatible with 1.5 degrees. But the other transformation that's going on is that as a global population, we need to significantly reduce the amount of energy every one of us is actually using. We need to share energy. Not everyone can afford to use as much energy as a French or as an American. And so there's also that energy usage per capita. That's the elephant in the room, and no one wants to discuss because it's too controversial. But that's part of the mix of solutions that we need to consider. So to your question, Emmanuelle, I'm a business leader. Where do I start? I think the first step is to set an ambitious target. Acknowledging that you will not know how to deliver on it, and it's fine. So it's a step into the unknown. But as a business leader of small or large companies, I think we have the responsibility to drive change from the top. And that means setting ambitious targets that are in line with science. And then really harness the power of your company, the innovation power, the human capital, the social capital, to rethink your value proposition at large, to rethink the way you add value to society, the way you add value to your customers, and do this in a way that's compatible with your climate and sustainable development goals. So to me, the responsibility of business leaders is to drive a redefinition of value in their companies. Yeah.
Thanks, Marion. Well, that's a good transition for a next set of questions. One thing that I heard from COP26 in Glasgow, amongst the many feedback and optimistic, pessimistic from there, is that the real victim of the climate process might have been trust. So, failing to deliver on pledges, the zero washing, failing to implement and act beyond the pledges. But on the other hand, it's also revealing who the real leaders are and what does it mean to be a real leader, a climate leader, in understanding the science, as you said, Marion, taking the bold and timely transformative commitments, embracing the disruptions in business models and pivoting from words into action. So this takes me to discussing what are the climate leadership skills that are going to take us there and beyond. So what are the values, what are the skills, what are the behaviors that are going to take us there? And for this, we would like to take you into breakout rooms where you can discuss in a more intimate group from your perspective and listening to others. What are those climate leadership skills that are going to take us there and beyond? We do have time to share a little bit. Do you want to share any insights or what happened in the intimacy of those smaller groups? Anything that you want to share? Gilles, are you still around? Or maybe Damien, if you are, can't see you.
Yep, Giles here. Did you mean Gilles? Giles is
yeah,
okay?
Giles.
Okay, so our group, it was very nice. big questions were about how to deliver things at scale, how to come over the challenge of communicating, and a big message from Marion in that group was the need for empathy and listening as a leadership skill to be able to accelerate learning. So that was probably the big message.
Okay, well, my personal takeaway was the last thing that was mentioned in my group, which was the story of the lead negotiator woman at the Paris COP agreement, who started to cry a few minutes before the end of the event, the whole 10 days, because she figured out that nothing major was going to be decided. And she said that when she started crying, the atmosphere and the desire to really achieve something together started to change. So I call this vulnerability, and I think vulnerability is a fantastic weapon to be handled with care, but very powerful.
Beautiful. Anyone else wants to share? Otherwise, it's time to wrap up and say thank you. So we've seen that climate leadership is very central to the transition to regenerative businesses, and we've understood that it takes us all and whole, so the whole of us and all of us, to achieve this net zero and a thriving planet, and we will get there collectively. And thank you very much, everyone, for listening. And I'm turning to you, Christophe.
Yes, so thank you for doing a fabulous job, Emmanuelle, and to Guillaume and Marion. And it was fantastic. Thank you, all of you, for being here. There's many forms of allies here, and the allyship is growing. So we are very happy about it. Our next session will be a little bit closer to the individual and to individual leadership. So, we've had already reinventing the currency of the regenerative economy, which many of you attended. Fantastic. Accelerating the shift towards a more regenerative food system. Today was going beyond net zero carbon with regenerative business. But in January, we have a special occasion, an even more special occasion, because one of our allies has just written a book, and her name's Alexia, and she's going to give us on Monday, or in January, building personal resilience for a resilient planet. So we're looking forward to her. I'm hoping all of you will be there, because she's going to give her book, the best of it, with some other speakers, and looking forward to see you then. So thank you, everyone, for your time, and let's keep accelerating the shift towards the regenerative economy, ally to ally, and let's keep fostering those bonds between self, others, and nature. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Great.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.